Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Burwen. I'm a guest of React, Watershed, and Pervasive Media Studio. So thanks for having me today. The name of my talk is The Elements and Spaces of Interactive Storytelling. There's like Twittery things over here, so if you feel like talking about me on the internet, that's always a big boost to my self-esteem, so feel free to chat on Twitter about how awesome or how terrible my talk is today. So a little bit about who I am. So my background is traditionally in video game development. I used to work for Electronic Arts, making like airplanes and trains for James Bond, Activision making skate parks for Tony Hawk. I started up a studio called Cognito Comics, and we did an interactive graphic novel called Operation Ajax. Just a show of hands, how many people here have actually heard of Operation Ajax? Okay, a handful of you guys, that's pretty cool. And then most recently I was working for Disney as a consultant, helping them do sort of theme park related storytelling across live spaces and mobile devices. The topic of interactive storytelling is something that fascinates me, and it's a really vast topic. And as much as I want to sort of dig into all the different facets of that, we've only got so much time today. So my hope is that what I'll leave you with is a lens and context for understanding interactive stories. So think of this talk as a way of providing you with tools for sort of looking at these things and understanding why they're successful or why they fail. So let's start with the 4 elements. You've got technology as sort of a foundation for publishing and creating these things. Story is about what happens in your interactive experience. Aesthetics is how it looks or how it sounds. And user experience, of course, is how it feels to interact with. Traditionally, film is it's a passive medium, so it doesn't really have user experience in the traditional sense. And it's aesthetics backing a story. It's really about telling a story in film. In games, we have technology backing user experience. And very rarely, at least only recently, I think, story has really become a factor in games. And so if you want to break it down a little bit more clearly, we call the interactivity in games mechanics. And so I really want to focus on the relationship between mechanics and story today. And I call that narrative mechanics. So narrative mechanics exists on a spectrum. And the spectrum of narrative mechanics, if you want to use games and film as your sort of anchor points for how this spectrum works, there are 2 extremes. So at one extreme, you've got interactivity, and the other is completely passive, right? So film doesn't really have an interface. You just sit and you watch it. What that means is that games are really built for mechanical depth. And the further you go down the mechanical depth, the further away you get from a passive experience. I would say the closer you go to a passive experience, the more emotionally complex that experience can be. Another way to think about this is feeling versus doing, right? So I would say film is really great at above-the-neck verbs like laugh and cry and empathize, things that you don't really do in a game. Games are great for all the below-the-neck verbs like kick and shoot and run and jump and all those other things that are great for games. What I really wanted to explore in this talk today is how games and film intersect into new formats for interactive stories. So everyone here should recognize Pong, right? This is 1972. This is I use this as an anchor point for the first sort of mainstream video game. And there's, obviously there's doing in this. Pong is all about, essentially playing a simplified game of table tennis. And if you contrast that to the first film, 1878 Horse in Motion, it's very simple. It's literally stringing together a series of photographs to create what was the first sort of motion picture. And to go a little bit deeper with this, I think aside from that one is interactive and one is passive, what really sort of anchors these 2 formats and their differences is that games are digital. They're born digital. They're a product of the computer age. Without all of that ancillary technology, we wouldn't be able to have games at all in the video format. Film is an analog experience traditionally, right? It's a series of photographs that's played back on tape. And in 1978, something interesting happens. How many people had a Laserdisc player? Did anyone here? 1, 2 of you guys, awesome. Essentially, it's like a giant oversized CD that allowed you to really quickly skip around in a video experience, which was not possible before, video went digital. And as a result, we get our first sort of interactive story. Dragon's Lair, anyone? No? A handful of you guys, right? So if you watch really carefully, so it's like things will blink and you have to like hit the button at the right time so Dirk doesn't die. So the animation was done by Don Bluth, who is a Disney-level animator, and the production value of this is pretty high given what it was at during the time. It was basically an interactive video with really simple mechanics. There wasn't a whole lot you could do in this except essentially press a button to not die. That was the depth of the mechanics in Dragon's Lair, and it was groundbreaking. It was really cool. No one had ever done this before, and I think the Laserdisc really opened the door for that to be possible. So if you want to think about passivity versus agency or active, in Dragon's Lair as a linear experience, you have these large chunks of film, essentially, with little slices of interactivity. And you don't do much. If the screen blinks and you hit the right button, and the story continues, or else Dirk will die many hundreds of horrible animated deaths. Games continue to evolve. 1985, everyone here hopefully knows Super Mario Brothers, right? It's a classic staple of video game culture. And it was really the beginning of the side-scrolling platformer. This was a huge hallmark for games. It was, it had a whole new type of interface compared to the Atari. You had the D-pad, and you had, a couple of buttons now, so you could do way more things than just press a button to not die. You could run and jump and stomp and kick and do all the great things that Mario was awesome at. And a couple years later, a French game developer named Eric Thiailly was inspired by both Dragon's Lair and Super Mario Brothers, and he tried to combine them into a game called Another World. This is actually available on iOS. It was re-released. This was a sort of super hallmark for games at the time because nothing had this level of fidelity. Eric actually created the design, the art, and the programming all for this game. The only thing that he didn't do was the sound, which is pretty outstanding for someone working in that industry. So you can see there's a lot of mechanics here. You can run, you can kick, you can jump. And if you pay attention really carefully right here, cutscene in the game. And so as we transition to these passive experiences, it meshes really smoothly with the gameplay. It was a really profound experience. No game had ever done this before. These sort of interludes of video. This is before we had disc-based media, and so this is all done in the same engine that was driving the game. It's all polygons and handmade. So as you're rocking the cage, those are the same controls that you used to just run back and forth earlier. It was really interesting to see that blend together. And then you get the Nintendo Blaster, and off you go. And the game just continues to get more awesome from there. Another World has a very different pattern to it compared to Dragon's Lair. It's actually large chunks of interactivity with small amounts of passive film-based experience sort of cut in between. So this is the first time that cutscenes appear in a game, and it kind of becomes our model ever since then in terms of how we like to blend these two things together. Virtua Fighter, anybody? You guys remember this? This game blew my mind in 1993 when it came out. This is the first 3D video game, right? This is 2 years after Another World. That sort of 2D modality becomes totally outdated, and we get like real-time 3D, and suddenly you can move a camera around this game world. Like camera language actually finally applies because you have to be able to view that content through a virtual camera. So 3D games emerge. This is the PlayStation 1994, right? We get two things. We get camera language, so now the language of film actually applies to games in a literal sense. And we get vast amounts of data because we go disc-based, right? This was a CD-based system, and then from there we go DVD-based, and then Blu-ray-based, and now we just get access to gigabytes and gigabytes of stuff. So when it comes to combining games and film together, you have a lot of possibility now. The possibilities you didn't have, before these systems existed. So the Lord of the Rings game is a really great example of this. This was an amazing way to sort of bring a franchise to interactive because you had a film with like gorgeous, film quality cutscenes, but unfortunately the actual real-time capabilities of the PlayStation were not going to match from a fidelity perspective at all. And so aesthetically they're similar, but from a fidelity standpoint, they're totally jarringly different. And the doing versus feeling is just not going to match. What I find very interesting about this is the techniques that EA tried to use in bridging these two things together. All right, watch for it. It's going to come up in a second here. Right here. See how it cuts to pre-rendered and then to the game. So it's not at all about acting. It's really about doing, I think, in terms of how that's optimized. So, I guess it raises the question, why can't we have both mechanical depth and emotional complexity at the same time? Obviously, when your fidelity is different in terms of how the things look and feel, it's going to be really jarring. And you can see the technique that EA used there. They had a pre-rendered in-between state to try to smooth it out from the photoreal characters to the low-poly PlayStation ones. But I think there's something else going on here. You could argue that fidelity doesn't matter anymore because Virtua Fighter, for example, looks like this today. Like, the games are getting really good at conveying realistic-looking characters. The problem that we run into, though, there's a couple, but the first one, of course, is the Uncanny Valley. The Uncanny Valley, for those who don't know about it, is this like weird graph of likability and sort of like comfortableness you feel around virtual characters. So as you approach realism in sort of a virtual character, you start to develop affinity for that character, and then as soon as it doesn't match, there's this huge drop off, and that character becomes repulsive to us and creepy. And in games, that's a real problem. Even though we can do real time characters that look convincing when they're static. This is Alan Wake. Do you guys see this game? This is a Microsoft exclusive title. And the problem with this game is that, it's a horror game and the characters that you're supposed to be rooting for look creepier than the actual zombies you're fighting. So Uncanny Valley is a bitch. It's a real challenge. And I think it's only recently in pre-rendered graphics that we've been able to overcome that. So one of the best examples of creating that unified aesthetic between the passive and the interactive is a game by Naughty Dog called Last of Us. And I'll just show you a little bit of I think how when it's done well.
There you are.
Sarah, are you okay?
Yeah?
Does anyone come in here?
No, who would come in here?
Don't go near the doors. Just stand back there.
Dad, you're kind of freaking me out. What's going on?
It's the Coopers. Something ain't right with them. I think they're sick.
What kind of sick?
Jimmy!
Dad?
Honey, come here. Come here. Jimmy! Jimmy, stay back! Jimmy, I am warning you! Don't!
You shot him?
Sarah.
I saw him this morning.
Jimmy, there is something bad going on. And we have got to get out of here. Do you understand me?
Yeah.
Tell me, come on. Come on.
Where the hell you been? You have any idea what's going on out there?
I got some notion.
Holy shit. You got blood all over
It
you.
ain't mine. Let's just get out of here.
This ain't half the people in Sydney lost their minds.
Can we just please go?
Some sort of parasite or something. You gonna tell me what happened?
Later.
Hey, Sarah. How you holding up, honey?
I'm fine. Can we hear us on the radio?
Yeah, sure thing.
Thanks.
What I think is so interesting about Last of Us is it creates a unified aesthetic between film and game that's almost indiscernible, at least to the audience, because it's really well paced from when it cuts back and forth. It feels pretty good. It feels, like you get a sense that you're in an interactive movie, so to speak. This is, I think, in terms of having to keep those two experiences discrete, one of the most elegant solutions I've seen to solving that problem. So it isn't even, it's very sort of uneven and paced like a film, essentially. I think the other problem with being able to sort of combine these two elements or these two spaces of interactivity and passive media is how we control these experiences. This is the controller for Last of Us. It's the PlayStation 3. And if you think about it, the gamepad is really built for mechanical depth. It's really about having lots of buttons that you can press to do lots of different things. And that's really how our control schemes have evolved over time, from the Atari to the Nintendo to the PlayStation 1 controller, which, as you noticed, looks very much like the PlayStation 3 controller, and actually a lot like the PlayStation 4 controller. So it's great having all those buttons. I think we kind of solved that problem almost 20 years ago. But the other side of this is that controller is highly abstract. And I think it's great for doing, it's not very good for having emotional depth. The more abstraction you have, the less emotional, I think, depth you have in what you're doing. And it's really built for the living room. It's really designed to sort of be a surrogate for the remote control, which is how we used to interface with our TVs before then. So you basically have this huge graph of separate experiences, and the goal here is to really combine these things together. And as long as you have an abstract interface, you're going to struggle with that. So in order to figure out how to really achieve that sort of purple dot of, combining things, we're going to look to the other spaces that stories are told. So we talked a minute ago about the hearth. The other three spaces are the reading nook, right? So iPads are awesome here. The workbench, which is now basically like a PC, and anywhere, which has become the smartphone, and will probably turn into wearable technology, and whatever else goes in that space. And what's really interesting about these different spaces is that our attention economies are totally different between them. In the hearth space, we're used to sitting down and basically giving our attention to one thing for large periods of time. The workbench, is like you might multitask between tabs, but you have a place to sit and you have a place to work, and it's a long sustained attention span. The reading nook is more about sort of deeper, sort of like sit down for half an hour, 20 minutes, maybe an hour tops, and do it in all sorts of different spaces, from coffee shops to your home to an office or vice versa. And then the cell phone is really about one of communication. So we don't really spend a lot of time, doing deep narrative experience on our phone. It just doesn't fit the context of that device. What I like to say is that the longer our attention span, the higher the value of the content that we're consuming there. And if you want to think about that literally translating to value, if you use games as your model, basically you can say that value determines coherence, and that's when the four elements balance each other out. The right level of mechanical depth, the right level of production value, or all these things that are going to build around that attention span. So literally, if you want to use games as your model, in the Hearth space, Last of Us is a $60 experience, and you're lucky to get maybe 20 to 30 hours out of that, out of that game. In the PC or Workbench space, you can use Steam and you can get games from anywhere from 5 to 50. And I think because these things come with chairs and we're used to spending lots of time there, it makes a lot of sense. And especially in the Workbench space, the same device for content consumption is also the device for content creation. So you have a really interesting relationship. $3 to $5 in the mobile phone space, so very hard to do rich narrative. And in the tablet space, it's where you get more of a sort of one level up from that. And that's where I want to focus today for my case studies. So this is a documentary called Alma, Tale of Violence. You're watching this sort of Guatemalan gangster talk about her, like it's almost like a confessional. She's sitting there the entire time being interviewed, and it's really hard to listen to her talk. Like the stuff she does is really dark. And above her, you have these visuals that'll sort of fly by, and you can kind of look away from her and have her become voiceover to other material that's going on above her head. And you'll notice that this runs on both the PC, and it also runs on an iPad. Another one that's really great is, Operation Ajax, of course. This is my book. So Ajax is essentially a print format book that we split into pieces to allow us to actually animate and add a little bit of sound to. And so you can kind of get a sense for it here in terms of how it works. It's like taking those assets, just like with Alma, and just tweaking them ever so slightly so that you can have interactivity on top of the story. So you can see me sort of just tapping through it here. Kind of gives you an idea of trying to make it a reading experience, even though it's got interactivity built in. And then what's also cool about it is that it's historical, it's socio-political, and we had all this extra material that we wanted to embed into it. So at certain points in the story, you can actually pull up extra information on the page. So a star will pop up, whoop, and you can tap on it, and you can actually see the document that character is reading, which is really cool. So it's just a way of saying, well, now that I have you starting and stopping along the way, and you're used to touching the screen, it's not a big ask to have you drill down and check out other pieces of information. Once we went digital, we had all this research material for the book. We had like newsreel footage and declassified documents and photos. And so the question became, well, if we have all this great material that was originally just going to be like a printed reference section in the book, how do we embed it in a meaningful way into the story? And so we actually built out a file section. So this sort of gives you a clue for that. And you can actually go and explore the files that character is looking at right on the iPad. And so there are the files, and you can open them. And you actually can browse dossiers on any of the characters. So here's Churchill, for example. And so it's a way of trying to make photography and text interesting. So there's also declassified documents and newsreel footage and things like that. It's pretty cool. So I wouldn't call these truly narrative mechanics. I'd say that this is more a layer of interface on top of a passive linear story. And I think it's one step closer to truly having interactive storytelling. It's definitely a step up, I think, from a print format book that's just a PDF on the iPad or a film that you watch there. The question, I think, is really how to combine these things together and have the interface become part of the story. Has anyone here played with this before, Windowsill? This one's awesome. So you can just sort of watch. It's like this super playful, fun little, almost like a dollhouse. And there's no instruction given as to what to do. You kind of have to just figure it out for yourself. But from the sounds and the interactivity, like it's all got this really playful, fun, sort of exploratory feel to it. That actually is available not only on a web browser for free, but also on the iPad. And what's so fascinating about Windowsill is that it's a profoundly different experience emotionally if you play it with a mouse and keyboard versus using it with your finger on an iPad. And I think there's an obvious reason for that. The mouse and keyboard is a level of abstraction, and the iPad is sort of a natural user interface. It's emotionally one step closer to, just actually interacting with that content yourself, so it feels really good. So I've seen this repeated with other games. One of my favorites that works really well is a Walking Dead game. So the Walking Dead game isn't a mechanically deep game. In fact, it's actually mechanically really shallow. What's difficult about it is that you're constantly under stress having to make really simple, what would seem like simple decisions, like when to actually go after the keys to your handcuffs when there's a zombie there. And so the game constantly just has you making decisions more than actually having to interact in a deep mechanical way. So Walking Dead, yeah, it's just really intense, and it actually doesn't require a lot of like skill to play. It's really just about making these decisions and being under duress, and I think that's a really cool way to flip the whole what is challenging about a video game on its head. Because when you're on the iPad, you don't get the option of mechanical depth in the same way. It's really about gestures and touching and having this intimate experience. And that game is available on the Mac and the PC and the Xbox and the PlayStation. And it's a dramatically, like emotionally different experience on those platforms. So this is a puzzle game that is basically essentially built exactly for the iPad. It's entirely gesture based, and again, mechanically it's simple, but it's got a really cool depth to it based on just really being built for that natural interface. Pinching and zooming and swiping is all sort of the core part of how you engage with it. So. And the story is all implied by things you read and things you sort of engage with in a tactile sense. And if you think about it, the iPad being part of the reading nook space is great for reading. It's actually one of the few places I think that text really works. Because when you have to read text on your PC or on your TV, it's not a very good experience, but it's like totally makes sense on the iPad. And so all the gestures feel really good. It's like almost how you would, interface with that object in real life. So I call these examples of true interactive narrative, where we're really starting to blend story and interactivity together. You get mechanical depth and emotional complexity seamlessly interwoven. And these are very new examples. These are not things that were around for a while that were ported over. These are things that, essentially were built for the ground up for that device. And they're not typically as mechanically deep as regular games, and they're not as emotionally complex as film. They're sort of somewhere in the middle. I think what really contributes to that, like I was saying, is that you just don't have the mechanical depth opportunity when you're using a single finger to interact with your experience compared to the other places we've had this in the past. This new PlayStation, the new Xbox, they're coming out later this year, and the controllers haven't really changed. Those should all look very familiar to you. But what's new, of course, is that both the Xbox and the PlayStation have camera-based systems for tracking your body. Right, the Kinect started this in 2010. It's now a key. It's like a fundamental part of the Xbox, and Sony, still playing catch-up, I'd say, is now including this in the PlayStation 4. And essentially, what this does is it turns your body into an entire, way of interacting with a story. So that's really cool. I think we're at the tipping point potentially of overcoming the abstraction of that controller. And then, of course, how many people here have heard of the Oculus Rift? Oh, good. Okay, handful of you guys as well. So the Oculus is really exciting because it sort of accounts for that last piece of that previous graph, right? It gives you the head as a way to affect agency as well. This is actually some photos of the lab that the Oculus came out of. It's sort of this is at University of Southern California, and the woman in the top left right here, her name's Nani de la Peña. She's sort of pioneering this new format of storytelling, completely built around head-mounted displays. And she did a project called Hunger in LA. This is she's calling it immersive journalism. And essentially what she did is she was doing a story, her background's in journalism, and she was doing a story on people, who are struggling to find enough to eat in Los Angeles, and they were at a food line, and they were recording, and a man went into a diabetic coma, and they recorded the whole thing with audio. And from there, they were able to recreate the entire scene virtually using these sort of like crude video game characters. And what they did is they sort of reenacted the entire thing in a video game world, and then you can actually sort of walk through it with this headset. And you don't have any agency in terms of being able to affect the outcome or the characters. You're kind of like a ghost. You're sort of just in the space at human scale with this camera on your head. It was profoundly emotional. You can actually see the woman here who's experiencing it. She's actually crying. And I was trying to figure out why that was, because if you think about it, I mean, the visuals are really crude. It doesn't have the same level of fidelity as a commercial video game. And I think what the answer is that there's no abstraction in the interface in terms of being a witness to these events, right? If I want to move my head, I literally just move my head. And it was really cool. I would argue the less abstraction interface, the more emotional connection we feel to our content. So then it begs the question, can our emotions affect agency in interactive stories? If you think about how we interact with other people and the world around us, it's not just about our bodies and about where we can look, but how we feel. Like if you're having a conversation with somebody and they're in a really crappy mood, you're going to pick up on that, right? Like likewise, if they feel really happy, you're probably going to pick up on that too. And so I'd argue that our emotions are able to affect the world around us. And I think it raises the question, will that become part of the landscape for these interactive stories, where our emotions become, essentially an ability to affect agency? So the answer is we're working on it. It hasn't really come to fruition yet, I'd say. These are all sort of experimental, but here's a video of the emotive headset, which essentially picks up brainwaves and turns it into output. Anyway, so it's like Pong, basically, right? For, emotive interface. It's really, really basic, but it's there. I mean, we're starting to, see all these other pieces kind of come online. So where is this all going, right? What is the point of all of this new technology and all of this stuff? Well, if you want to use film as an example, I like to use film as an example. Citizen Kane, right, 1941. This was the first time that I think film kind of emerged as a modern art form. We've been experimenting with it ever since Horse in Motion with like new formats of editing and cutting and adding sound. And then Citizen Kane kind of like randomly just put all that stuff together, and it was this breakout experience, and everyone went, oh my God, that's the answer, right? And in a way, I think it really set the groundwork for modern filmmaking ever since then. If you want to use Horse in Motion as your example for when that all started, it was about 63 years between those two films, right? In games, it's only been 41 years since Pong, and we've seen a lot of stuff come along since then. Obviously, the fidelity has increased greatly, as you can see. The interface has changed quite a bit too, and what's really exciting is that most of these changes have come since 2006 and 2007, when first the Wii came out and then the iPhone, right? Those were big agents of change. And I think where it really gets exciting is when you start to combine these things together. Like on their own, they're compelling, but what's really interesting is when they start to be combined into to new formats. So the Oculus is cool, but one of its challenges is that it doesn't track motion. It only tracks sort of Y and Z axis. So it's a very limited application on its own. But if you actually add motion control to it, I think it really opens the box for where the stuff can go. And so on the left, this is called the Hydra Motion Controller. I think it came out 2011. And there's this whole community now of indie game developers who are able to communicate using the internet and easily publish their content using Steam or publish to the App Store and have access to tools like Unity, this sort of game engine that allows people to easily make games. And none of that existed before. Like when Nintendo was around, you had to be essentially like a Nintendo developer to make the stuff work. So I'm going to show you an example of, I think, where this stuff is starting to really get exciting when you combine these things.
So this is my RTS. You can see that I'm standing above a castle. It feels like it's right there at my feet, like I'm on a 1 meter by 1 meter patch of island. Everything is kind of like a tiny model world. But what I've done is that you can bend down to look at the world, and as you go down, everything scales up. So once you get down to the ground level, it feels like a gigantic castle. Like that tower looks like it's 100 meters tall, and I'm the same size as all the guys in the world. So that was the basic mechanic, and it took me a while to get that right.
And I think that's just amazing, right? So anyway, so to recap everything, 4 elements, right, plus 4 spaces equals coherence. And so, it's really about understanding, I think, what makes sense in these different spaces. And the more you understand how we spend our time there and how we value content there and how those interfaces have emotional impact on what we're doing, the greater your chances of doing something successful and adding something of value. Because unfortunately, most of the stuff that's happening, especially in the iPad space, can be really gimmicky or really broken. And I think the best thing we can do as pioneers in this space is try to understand the difference between something gimmicky and something valuable, and therefore make the best decisions creatively going forward. I want to give a shout out to Jesse Schell. He actually coined the terms for the 4 elements and the 4 spaces. So I met him at GDC. He's a phenomenal speaker on sort of a thought leader in games and interactive storytelling. So if you find this interesting, please do check out his other content on the web. If you want to know more about Operation Ajax, there's the URL for that, and that's my email. So thanks so much.
For me, interactive storytelling, as in fact reinforced by your showing us the immersive journalism piece from LA, is actually about putting people into the story and just allowing them the only interaction they have is that they're allowed to unfold it in the way that they want. So they're not actually affecting outcomes, but in the same way that life is non-linear, so they're experiencing stuff in a non-linear way, possibly parallel time stuff and stuff like that. Just wonder how you react to that.
Oh yeah, I think that's a valid critique. I mean, the challenge that we're in right now is that we don't have all the tools available to build out like a truly virtual experience. But Hunger in LA actually is linear. The only difference, like you don't have you're just a camera that watches a 3D animation unfold, if you want to think about it in the most basic sense. The difference is that it's true events with real audio, and I think that that's a huge part to cementing the emotional connection. And the fact that to view this virtual simulation unfolding, I'm using my body, I'm using the same muscles and faculties that I would use to watch a real event. So, you can actually walk right through the characters. There's no collision or anything. And what's so weird about it is that once my body becomes the agents for moving me around and viewing this thing, my inclination is to not run into the characters. I almost treat them psychologically like real people. And so I think there's layers of complexity on top of that. You could then add collision to yourself and to the characters so that they kind of move out of the way or look at you or acknowledge you when you're near them. And then, of course, it raises the question of how do I actually communicate with them, right? Which is a huge problem right now. Because in the past, you would type into a keyboard and, how many people have used Siri and it just does not get you at all, right? You're like, I need to go here. It's like, cupcakes. And you're like, that's not what I was asking for. So, we have this sort of uncanny valley of interface in the same way. So I think that what's been shown with Hunger is really promising. I think that that's a really fast way to start building things that are more emotionally complex, but they don't have mechanical depth. There's no mechanical depth to them at all. And I think the true answer is to have that balance where you have both mechanical depth and you have emotional complexity interspersed. So it's a step forward, but I don't think that's where we're going to end up. I think that's just the beginnings.
I'm wondering if it's ever going to be possible that a tablet can never have the mechanical depth which allows you to have that interactive storytelling experience. The difference between, of course, a controller nowadays and compared to a pad is that a tablet is that, yes, you're using your finger and your phone, but you get the force feedback, which you don't get on the mouse and keyboard, and you certainly don't get on the tablet. And so, seemingly, from my experience, when you're using a tablet, it's very difficult to get that interactive narrative. It's what you did with Operation Ajax. It's kind of like Tom Hanks' dream in Big when he had that interactive comic that will one day take place. But it's still a novelty. You have this piece of glass in front of you that you tap and the story comes alive. It isn't able to physically touch you like a pad can now. If you close your eyes and use a tablet and stick some earphones in, you can get that interactive storytelling, something like Nightjar, if you've ever experienced it.
Which one?
Nightjar.
Nightjar?
Yeah, it's not available in the US, but if you download it on the UK store, it's a free download. You have to close your eyes, stick your earphones in, and you interactively go for a spaceship, but you keep your eyes closed the entire time. So that works, but that completely takes away the physical, apart from what you do with your fingers. And I'm just wondering, do you think it's possible to actually ever get that interactive physical experience, without using a controller?
I mean, if you had asked me in 2006, do you think that mobile computing will ever be successful, and I hadn't seen the iPhone before, I don't know if I could have honestly answered that, right? I think that there's all sorts of technological possibilities that are just outside of our, perception at the moment because of the way things sort of evolve. So you never know. There probably will be some sort of technological breakthrough that's able to bring that to us, that sort of haptic feedback I think you're describing. I mean, if you think about the Rumble was also, Nintendo's been a huge pioneer in interface for a very long time in games. And, when the Rumble Pack was introduced, I think in the N64, at first it seemed like a novelty, but then it just became standard issue. And, it's limited. It just vibrates, when certain things happen. But there's a lot to that. And now if you think about Android phones, when you touch the screen, it adds a little bit of haptic feedback as well. So I think it's a tool that's always kind of been there from sort of that level of complexity, but it's limited to the fact that you're interfacing with a piece of glass. There is no tactile feedback. There's actually a really good article called A Rant on the Future of Interactivity. And the author is essentially saying that fingers under glass or pictures under glass, I think is what he describes it as, it's totally limited. It has no representation of actually doing these things. Someone asked me the same question yesterday about haptic feedback, and I used Rock Band and Guitar Hero as great examples of how a really cool tactile interface can totally make an experience amazing. How many people here have played either of those games? Rock Band or Guitar Hero? A handful of you guys? It was awesome, and there's no way that a gamepad or a piece of glass is going to be as effective as that. It was very narrowly focused, but really powerful. So I hope the answer isn't that we need lots of cheap throwaway physical interfaces that are just popular for, the moment that game stays in vogue, but I think it does show the power of that. So I guess the answer is I don't know, but I hope it is cool and awesome, and I do agree that it's important.
I'm interested in whether you regret anything about what you did in Operation Ajax. What you might do differently in the future.
Yeah, that's a whole other talk. I actually wanted to do one on like just like the failures of that project, because whenever you're pioneering anything, there's a lot of failure involved. I wish that I had rethunk the strategy from a business perspective going forward the moment we decided to go to the iPad. Just really briefly, the history of that project is that it started out as a print format book, and a 210-page one at that. It was like a massive artistic endeavor. It took 2 years to write the script, and then we had to find artists who were going to commit to producing all this content for us. And it was just very difficult, and we didn't really rethink the mobile space as a space that needed to be designed for from a monetization and attention span approach, right? So by the time we were sort of into production, we missed our window to come out early as one of the first 100 apps on the iPad, and so at that point you're sort of left to the mercy of the machinery of the App Store and luck and all these other factors that make you kind of either succeed or fail, and most people do fail. I mean, the App Store is brutal. I guess where I'm going with this is that just because you make great content doesn't make you succeed. And I think in the App Store and on mobile devices especially, like these things are like so hard to engage people on. We put Ajax on the phone. It was probably a waste of time because no one wants to sit here for like 2 hours and read a really deep thing. So, I mean, I don't have a succinct way of answering that. There are lots of...
What about the interactivity and like the actual, maybe more detail about like the mechanics of it?
I think that it was very successful from a creative standpoint. I'm really proud of adding that level of interface. I think that an auto read feature would have been cool. I think the biggest challenge we ran into is that we didn't own the technology. So, at the end of the day, I didn't have the resources as a company to really keep like maintaining and refining the software because it was just such a massive product. And I haven't seen anything come out since then that matches it from a complexity and I think artistic merit standpoint. Of course, I'm biased, but I'd like to see someone come out and do a better job. I really would. And I think that it just is a testament to how difficult that content can be. But I'm very proud of the interactivity. I think it's very successful for the most part.
I was interested, a lot of the game examples that you gave were kind of single-player games.
Yeah.
And obviously, historically, kind of reading has been a single-player experience, but one of the massive drivers in kind of games industry has been the massively multiplayer online experience. So I guess my question to you is, do you see an environment where the process of reading can become kind of massively multiplayer?
If you look at analogies within that sphere, right, like book clubs and exchanging of ideas while you're reading, like there's ways to build a social context around passive or single-person experiences since they began. People like to gather around tables and debate, books and film and literature. I've never seen anyone really, I don't know if gamify is the right word, but there's a website that went really popular recently. It was like about hip-hop lyrics online, and I forgot the name of it, but people would annotate them and talk about the history, and it became wildly successful. And people really like to contribute. I think Wikipedia is another example of where people like to discuss any sort of idea in a collaborative sense. So I'd like to think that exists. I haven't seen anyone do it, but that doesn't mean it's either not out there or successful.
Occasionally you read articles about people who are deaf, who are blind, who've been given a special kind of echolocation type device, and they learn the brain adapts to that kind of thing. So they're using a different input method, and their brain develops it. Has there been any research done on getting similar things for haptic feedback, or any kind of feedback that is difficult to get through your fingers, or whatever you want to get back through, which you can't get through?
I'm sure there is research out there. I haven't personally researched it myself, but just to use your analogy, for example, of how we can remap things. So a friend of a friend he's been paralyzed from basically the neck down, and the way he's had to rebuild his life is he's able to remap certain aspects of his what makes him feel good. So it's kind of personal, but if someone sucks on his thumbs, like that becomes like a sexual act for him. It's totally weird, right? But there is the ability to like remap these things, and he's like a well-known speaker on disability and sex, for example, because of that. So the brain's a really powerful thing. It's very elastic, and I think we're building for the assumption that you're a functional human being that knows how to interact with the world in roughly the same way as everybody else. But I don't see why there's any reason why we couldn't start to, experiment, at least in that's the side of the industry with, for the limitations of our technology, if you can remap to this area, it can become very effective and feel very visceral.
I've no kind of figures to back this up, but it seems like passive technology like films, TV, even books, radio, that kind of stuff is still obviously very popular.
Yeah.
Do you think over the next, say, 20, 30 years we're going to see more of a shift towards interactive fiction as the more popular form of entertainment?
I'd just say interactive entertainment in general. I mean, a big part of that is that the game console is not a critical piece of hardware to own in your life. But imagine, does anyone here not own a cell phone? Right. Does anyone here not own a smartphone? Case in point, right? Pretty much everyone here probably has some sort of big piece of rectangular glass in their pocket that, before 2007 they wouldn't have owned. And now this leaves the house with you like everything else. And so even though you might not play games like as part of your cultural identity, you always have the opportunity to opt in. And it's only going to get weirder and crazier from there because everyone needs to communicate. It's a critical part. These things started out as communication devices and have transitioned into like full-on computers, for better or worse. I mean, I try to avoid these things now because it takes away my attention from the world around me, but that's just an endemic problem, I think, with our society, right? The question is, where do you draw that line with how interactivity becomes a part of our daily lives? But I think that the popularity of Angry Birds and Farmville were sort of like the entry-level video game for the masses, and people are now maturing in their tastes, and the demographics are really interesting. It's now equally men and women who play games, across most spaces, and that just wasn't the case, several years ago. And I think that's just the growing trend. So that doesn't mean that books are going to go away or films going to go away, but we're going to have more opportunity, right? And I think that as we have developed appetites and for computing in general and interactivity, then we're more likely to pick something up that we wouldn't before. So. And it has to be rewarding. I think that the problem with games is that they aren't as rich emotionally as film in the past. So, if you want that, you're going to have to go to a different format for the time being.
How desirable or how feasible would a voice control? I don't know what the technical term, I can't remember what the technical term is.
I think it's huge. I think that that's critical. So to crib from Jesse's talk, which I saw at GDC in San Francisco, he talked about film became taken seriously as a medium when it could speak, and he believes that games will be taken seriously as a medium when they can listen, right? That's how you talk to a virtual character, and natural language processing is huge for that. And we have struggled with it, I think, that because it just hasn't worked. Right? It's anything short of like a really accurate assessment of your speech is a failure. So unless it's like, again, the uncanny valley problem. It starts to build and it sort of works and then it just breaks completely. And then once it actually like functions correctly, you're back up and it feels really good. So I'd like to think that the characters in games, for example, like take on AI personas, and that Hunger in LA experience would become one of the most interactive things you could have, because you could talk at the characters and they would turn and look at you and talk back, and that would be profound. And we've just never had that before. Did anyone here play Second Life by any chance? A couple of you guys? Or any other virtual worlds like Ultima Online or World of Warcraft, right? The challenge with those games, at least in the past, like if you're talking to another human being, you can talk to each other, you can hear each other, and you can respond. You might not be able to physically act out what you're feeling. You can like click from a drop-down menu of preset actions, but you can have that dialogue. So if that goes completely virtual, imagine mapping your body and your emotion and your voice to the input of a character on the screen, and having another virtual character map right back to you. I think that's profoundly deep. But we haven't, we're just sort of scraping the beginnings of all of that stuff. So
It might not work if you had, say, an Icelander trying to talk to somebody from Nicaragua in English. the ability to interpret what the other's saying might be a bit sort of disjunct.
yeah, I mean, theoretically it'd be translated maybe with some sort of intermediary thing, but I think it's a really profound and cool idea. I think that that's not outside of our possibility, the adjacent possible, and it's just a matter of time. Thanks, guys. Hope that was interesting.